My name is Robert. I am 72 years old. For 43 years, I worked as a structural engineer on massive construction projects across the country. I built bridges, skyscrapers, and industrial complexes. I spent decades away from home, working 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions, to ensure my family never wanted for anything. My wife Eleanor and I were married for 45 beautiful years. We built our lives together in a quiet, upscale neighborhood outside Boston. Our home was a stunning colonial-style mansion, sitting on 3 acres of meticulously maintained land. We paid off the mortgage with our own sweat and sacrifice. We raised our only daughter, Stephanie, with every opportunity money could buy. We paid for her Ivy League education. We helped her and her husband, Marcus, purchase their first home. We co-signed loans and provided down payments. We were always the supportive parents, standing quietly in the background, never asking for anything in return. 3 months ago, everything changed. Eleanor passed away after a sudden, aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came in February. By April, she was gone. Losing her felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out my heart. The house, which had always felt warm and alive, suddenly became cavernous and cold. Stephanie and Marcus came for the funeral. They offered the expected condolences. They stayed for 3 days. Then they returned to their busy lives in Manhattan, leaving me alone to drown in the suffocating silence of an empty home. I spent my days wandering through the rooms, touching Eleanor's belongings. I would sit in her favorite armchair, smelling her perfume that still lingered on the cushions. I would stare at her photographs and wonder how I could possibly continue existing without my compass. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was an attorney from a prestigious, old-money law firm in downtown Boston. He asked me to come to his office immediately. He said it concerned a private matter that Eleanor had arranged years ago, long before she became ill. He was confused. Eleanor and I shared everything. We had no secrets. We managed our finances together every Sunday morning at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing our investments. We were a team, united in every aspect of our lives. But I put on my best suit, drove into the city, and sat across from a man who handed me a small brass key. He told me he'd opened a safe deposit box at a private bank just 2 blocks away. The box was in Eleanor's name. He was listed as the sole beneficiary upon her passing. He walked to the bank, my mind racing with confusion and curiosity. The vault manager escorted me into a secure room and left me alone with a heavy steel box. My hands trembled as I turned the key and lifted the lid. He expected to find love letters. Maybe some family heirlooms. Perhaps vintage jewelry she had tucked away for safekeeping. Instead, I found $500,000 in perfectly bound stacks of $100 bills. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stared at the money. But that was not all. Beneath the cash was a thick manila envelope containing a legal deed and a handwritten letter from my wife. I unfolded the letter, immediately recognizing Eleanor's elegant cursive. The ink was slightly faded. She must have written it nearly 15 years ago. In the letter, Eleanor explained everything. The money and the deed belonged to a sprawling 10,000-acre ranch in Montana. It was a secret inheritance from her estranged father. He knew her father had been a difficult, controlling man who used his wealth to manipulate everyone around him. Eleanor had cut ties with him long before we met. What I did not know was that when he died, he left his entire estate to her. She wrote that she hid this wealth from me and from Stephanie because she wanted to protect our family from the corrupting influence of unearned money. She wanted Stephanie to grow up grounded, to understand the value of hard work, and to build her own life without waiting for a handout. She wanted our marriage to be built on genuine love and partnership, not on managing a massive fortune. But the most shocking discovery was still waiting for me. Attached to the deed was a secondary document. The Montana ranch was not sitting empty. It was currently leased to a major natural gas corporation. The land was quietly generating $75,000 every single month in royalties. This money had been funneling into a private trust for years. Completely untouched. Compounding silently. He sat in that metal room for over 2 hours, overwhelmed by emotion. Eleanor had carried this massive secret to protect the humble, honest life we built together. She was the most extraordinary woman I had ever known. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched her letter against my chest. I felt profound gratitude. But I also felt a deep, aching sorrow that she was no longer here to share this with me. Eventually, I composed myself. I placed the documents and the cash securely into my leather briefcase, walked out of the bank, and got into my car. As I drove back to the suburbs, my mind raced with possibilities. The grief was still there, a heavy weight on my shoulders. But now I had a new sense of purpose. I thought about Stephanie and Marcus. I knew they had been complaining about the rising cost of living in Manhattan. Marcus had recently lost his job at a hedge fund. They were drowning in credit card debt and struggling to keep up appearances. He thought about how much this money could help them. He could pay off their debts. We could take a family vacation to Europe, just like Eleanor always wanted. And I could set up a trust fund for my future grandchildren. He pulled into my quiet suburban street, eager to share the bittersweet news. He parked in my driveway, looking up at the beautiful brick facade of the $1.8 million home Eleanor and I had lovingly maintained for over 3 decades. But as I walked up the driveway, I noticed a large unmarked box truck parked near the side entrance. The front door was propped wide open. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I clutched my briefcase tightly and stepped through the doorway. The sight before me made me freeze in my tracks. There were 4 strange men inside my living room. They were aggressively pulling my antique paintings off the walls and wrapping them in thick moving blankets. Other men were dismantling the heavy oak dining table where Eleanor and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the last 35 years. The house was in absolute chaos. Boxes were piled in the hallway, filled with my personal belongings. And standing right in the center of the living room, holding a clipboard and barking orders at the movers, were my daughter Stephanie and her husband Marcus. I stood there invisible for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My own flesh and blood was tearing apart my home without a single word of warning. The excitement of the Montana ranch evaporated instantly, replaced by a chilling realization that my perfect family was a complete illusion. He cleared my throat loudly. Stephanie turned around, her eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before a smooth, rehearsed smile spread across her face. She had no idea what was inside my briefcase. And she had absolutely no idea that she had just declared war on a man who had nothing left to lose. He stood frozen in the entryway of my own house. My polished leather shoes felt glued to the hardwood floor as I watched 4 burly men in gray uniforms haul my belongings toward the front door. One of them was currently wrestling with a heavy gilded mirror that Eleanor and I had purchased on our 20th anniversary in Paris. Another was carelessly shoving my antique grandfather clock into a thick layer of industrial plastic wrap. The beautiful Persian rug that usually tied the whole living room together was already rolled up and tossed into a dark corner. The entire house was in a state of absolute chaotic ruin. And standing right in the massive center of it all, pointing and directing the movers like a seasoned project manager, was my daughter Stephanie. She was wearing expensive designer jeans and a crisp linen shirt, looking completely at ease while tearing apart the sanctuary her mother and I had built. Marcus stepped out from the kitchen, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He was wearing a sharp white blazer, carrying himself as if he already owned the property and was simply preparing it for an open house. It did not look like a man who was actively mourning his beloved mother-in-law. It looked incredibly satisfied. He gripped the handle of my heavy leather briefcase tightly. Inside said $500,000 in raw cash and the legal key to a future they knew absolutely nothing about. He cleared my throat loudly. Stephanie spun around. For a fraction of a second, her eyes widened in sheer panic. But then, a smooth, rehearsed smile spread across her face. It was the exact face she used when she was trying to sell a terrible financial deal to wealthy clients at her investment firm. "Dad," Stephanie said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that instantly made my skin crawl. "We did not expect you back from the city so soon. I thought you told us you were going to be out all afternoon dealing with the estate lawyers. What exactly is going on here, Stephanie?" he asked, keeping my voice dangerously level, despite the rage bubbling in my chest. "Why are there strange men in my house taking down my wife's paintings without my permission?" Marcus gracefully walked over and stood right beside her. "Robert, please try to stay calm," he said, purposely projecting his voice so the movers could hear him clearly. It was a highly calculated move designed to make me look like an unstable, emotional old man who was losing his grip on reality. "We are just trying to help you. We know how incredibly hard these past 3 months have been for you since Eleanor passed away. Help me?" he repeated, looking around the devastated living room once more. "You are actively dismantling my home." "My home, Marcus, the house I paid off with 45 years of hard work on construction sites." Stephanie sighed heavily, crossing her arms over her chest in a defensive posture. She walked over to the glass coffee table, picking up a glossy, colorful brochure. She held it out to me with a look of profound manufactured pity that made my stomach physically churn. "We need to be entirely realistic, Dad," Stephanie said softly, stepping a few inches closer. "You are 72 years old now. You are living in a massive 6-bedroom house all by yourself. The daily maintenance is simply too much for you to handle alone. The memories in these walls are clearly weighing you down and breaking your heart. You have been wandering around like a lost ghost since Mom died. It is simply not safe for you to be living here by yourself anymore." She slid the brochure smoothly across the surface of the coffee table. He looked down at it. The cover featured a group of sad elderly people sitting in wheelchairs on a patchy, dying lawn. The bold letters across the top read, "Green Meadows Assisted Living Facility." It was not a luxury retirement community. It was a low-income, state-run nursing home. A depressing, bare-bones facility where greedy families dumped their elderly relatives when they no longer wanted to deal with the burden of caring for them. "We have decided it is time, Dad," Stephanie continued, her tone hardening just a fraction, losing that fake layer of warmth. "We are selling your house. It is the absolute best thing for your physical health and your long-term future." Marcus stepped right up behind her, resting his perfectly manicured hands on her shoulders. It flashed me a cold, calculated smirk. It was a look of absolute undeniable triumph. I honestly believed he had won the grand prize. He believed he was dealing with a broken, grieving widower who would simply fold under their intense pressure and quietly sign away his entire life. Soon, for a brief, foolish moment, I actually felt a wave of deep pity for them. He looked at my only daughter, the girl I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the girl I had stayed up with late into the night helping with complex calculus homework. He wondered how much massive debt they must be hiding to resort to something so incredibly vile. He wondered what kind of severe financial ruin had pushed them to try and steal my home out from under me. My grip on the leather briefcase relaxed slightly. He realized I had the absolute power to fix this entire terrible situation right here and right now. He had $500,000 in raw cash sitting right there in my hand. I could easily pay off their overwhelming mortgage. He could clear whatever secret debts were currently drowning them in desperation. He could give them a clean slate and a fresh start. All I had to do was open the briefcase, show them the legal deed to the Montana ranch, and tell them that we were going to be completely okay. He took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to smile, preparing to be the forgiving, generous father who saves the day one last time. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell them about Eleanor's incredible secret gift, to tell them about the $75,000 a month in gas royalties that would secure our family for generations to come. But before the wonderful words could leave my throat, my eyes drifted back down to the glass coffee table. Sitting right next to that highly insulting nursing home brochure was a thick stack of legal documents. They were partially covered by a plain manila folder, but the top page was clearly visible under the harsh living room lights. It was a standard state legal document. The bold black letters at the very top of the page read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My breath caught sharply in my throat. He stepped closer to the table, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense text of the document. It granted full, unconditional legal control of my personal finances, my private medical decisions, and my real estate assets directly to Stephanie. It gave her the absolute legal authority to sell my house, drain my bank accounts, and commit me to a psychiatric facility against my will. But that was not what made my blood run completely cold. At the absolute bottom of the page, right next to a bright red official notary seal, was my signature. It was a perfect, flawless forgery of my specific handwriting. The hopeful smile died instantly on my lips. The fatherly pity I felt for my daughter evaporated into the thin air, replaced entirely by an icy, terrifying clarity. They were not just trying to force me to sell my home through emotional manipulation. They had already stolen it behind my back. They had committed severe federal fraud to legally strip me of my human rights, my financial independence, and my basic dignity. I slowly looked up from the forged document and met my daughter's gaze directly. Stephanie was no longer smiling her fake, reassuring smile. She saw exactly what I was looking at. She saw the dark realization violently wash over my face. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a single ounce of human guilt, she just stared back at me with a cold, defiant challenge in her eyes. They thought I was weak. They thought my deep grief had made me permanently blind and entirely helpless. But they had absolutely no idea what I had hidden inside my briefcase. And they had absolutely no idea what a man who has lost his beloved wife and his only daughter in the exact same month is truly capable of doing to protect his legacy. He kept my eyes locked on Stephanie for a long, agonizing moment before I slowly raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger at the glass coffee table. I made sure to let my hand shake, playing perfectly into the narrative they had already constructed in their minds. He needed them to believe that I was just an overwhelmed, confused old man who was entirely out of his depth. "Stephanie," I said, letting my voice waver just enough to sound vulnerable. What exactly is that document sitting right there next to the nursing home brochure? Why does it have my signature on it? I have absolutely no memory of signing any legal paper since your mother passed away. The heady tension in the spacious living room shifted instantly. The cold, defiant challenge in Stephanie's eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, frantic calculation. She glanced at Marcus, silently asking him to take the lead. Marcus did not miss a single beat. The cruel, triumphant smirk that had been plastered across his face just moments ago melted away with terrifying speed. In the blink of an eye, he transformed into the absolute picture of radiant empathy. His posture softened, his shoulders dropped, and he let out a long, sympathetic sigh that sounded so remarkably genuine, it almost made me doubt my own sanity. He walked over to the coffee table with slow, measured steps, completely ignoring the forged power of attorney document. Instead, he reached for a thick, unmarked manila folder that had been sitting just beneath it. He picked it up carefully, clutching it to his chest. As he approached me, his dark eyes were swimming with artificial sorrow. "Robert, we did not want to have this conversation like this," Marcus murmured softly, reaching out to gently touch my forearm. I had to force myself not to pull away from his toxic grip. "We were trying to spare you the profound pain of facing the harsh reality of your current medical situation." "My medical situation?" I echoed, furrowing my brow in faint confusion. "I am perfectly healthy. My heart is strong and my blood pressure is completely normal." "What on earth are you talking about, Marcus?" I opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of crisp hospital records. I recognized the official letterhead immediately. It was from the exact same private hospital where Eleanor had spent her final days. Marcus flipped to the third page and handed it to me with a look of profound theatrical sadness. "We spoke to Dr. Harrison on the day Eleanor passed," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, comforting whisper. "He was incredibly concerned about you, Robert." I pulled Stephanie aside in the hallway and asked her to keep a very close eye on your deteriorating mental state. I looked down at the document in my trembling hands. It was a genuine medical chart, stamped and dated by Eleanor's primary physician. But highlighted in bright yellow marker near the bottom of the page was a handwritten note added to the margins. It read, "Patient's husband is showing severe signs of grief-induced cognitive decline. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and full-time supervision to prevent accidental self-harm." I stared at those highlighted words, my mind racing to comprehend how they had managed to secure something so incredibly damning. Dr. Harrison was a busy man. He had barely spoken to him during Eleanor's final hours because I was too busy holding her fragile hand and praying for a miracle. Stephanie must have cornered him in the chaotic hospital corridor, spinning a tragic tale of an unstable, weeping father who was completely losing his mind. They had planted the dark seed of my insanity before my beloved wife was even cold in her hospital bed. Before I could even process the sheer depth of their betrayal. Stephanie stepped forward and firmly grabbed both of my hands. Her grip was tight, almost restrictive, as if she were trying to physically anchor me to the hardwood floor. She looked deep into my eyes, and for a fleeting second, I almost believed the intense, overwhelming sorrow written across her face. She was an incredibly talented liar. "Dad, you have to listen to us," Stephanie pleaded, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "You are not well. The grief has completely shattered your mind. You just do not realize how bad it has actually gotten over these last 3 agonizing months." "I am fine," I protested weakly, playing my pathetic part to perfection. "I am just mourning your beautiful mother." That is perfectly normal for a man who just lost his entire world. It is not just mourning, Dad, Stephanie insisted, squeezing my hands tighter. You have been wandering around this massive house in the middle of the night, talking to the walls. Last Tuesday, Marcus came over to drop off some groceries, and he found the front door wide open and the gas stove left burning on hot. You could have burned the entire house down, Dad. You have completely stopped eating unless we physically put the food right in front of you. You are slipping away from us, and I cannot bear the thought of losing you right after losing Mom. I stared at my daughter in absolute disbelief. None of what she was saying was remotely true. He had never left the stove on. He had never, ever left the heavy front door wide open. I had been perfectly capable of making my own meals and maintaining my daily routine. They were actively constructing a completely fabricated history, building an airtight legal narrative of my rapid mental collapse. They were gaslighting me in my own living room, slowly tightening the invisible noose around my neck. I honestly truly do not remember any of that happening, I whispered, letting my gaze drop to the floor, projecting the pitiful image of a broken, deeply confused elder. We know you do not remember, Robert, Marcus chimed in, stepping closer to gently rub my back in a soothing motion. That is exactly why we had to step in immediately. That is why we had to take full control of the situation before you accidentally hurt yourself. I slowly looked back up at the glass coffee table, pointing a shaking finger at the forged legal document one more time. But my signature. He did not sign that paper, Stephanie. He would absolutely never sign over my entire life to you without reading the terms. Stephanie released my trembling hands and took an incredibly deep, steadying breath. She looked deeply and directly into my eyes, her facial expression shifting perfectly into one of profound, unwavering nobility. She stood tall, projecting the heroic image of a highly devoted daughter making a terrible, heavy sacrifice for the greater good of her aging, ailing father. We forged it to save you the stress of paperwork, Dad, Stephanie confessed softly, her voice echoing with absolute unapologetic conviction in the silent, empty living room. We are actively selling the house to get you into a premium, round-the-clock luxury care facility where you will always be completely and incredibly safe. We are simply just protecting you. I heard the words leaving my daughter's mouth, but my brain refused to accept them for a long moment. We forged it to save you the stress. We are just protecting you. The sheer audacity of the lie was so massive, so incredibly hollow, that a violent wave of pure rage flared up inside my chest. He wanted to scream. He wanted to reach across that glass coffee table, grab the collar of her expensive linen shirt, and physically throw her out of my house. He wanted to pull the $500,000 in cash from my briefcase and throw it in her deceitful face, to watch her world crumble. But I did not move a single muscle. I am a retired structural engineer. My entire career was built on maintaining absolute composure during high-pressure situations on massive construction projects. When a crane is swaying in a storm, you do not panic. You analyze the structural integrity of the system, identify the lethal threats, and execute a precise sequence to survive the collapse. Right now, I was looking at a massive catastrophic failure. If I fought them right here, I would lose everything. Stephanie had just shown me the ultimate weapon. She had a medical document signed by a legitimate doctor claiming I was suffering from severe grief-induced cognitive decline. If I raised my voice, if I showed anger, if I called the police to report the forgery, Marcus would immediately use that exact anger as undeniable proof of my mental instability. They would call the authorities, show them the highlighted note, and used the forged power of attorney to legally drag me out of my own home. He would be locked away in a psychiatric ward before the sun went down, stripped of every human right I possessed. He realized with terrifying clarity that I was trapped in a corner. The only way to survive this trap was to make them believe it had worked perfectly. He had to play the fool. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken version of myself that they desperately needed me to be. He let out a long, shaky breath, making sure it sounded like a heavy sigh of defeat. He purposely relaxed my posture, letting my shoulders slump forward as if the invisible weight of my grief was suddenly too much for my fragile bones to bear. I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact with Stephanie, and stared blankly at the floorboards. He let my hands drop to my sides, allowing my grip on the heavy leather briefcase to loosen just enough to look entirely harmless. "You really think this is for the best, Stephanie?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly soft, injecting it with a frail, wavering tone of profound confusion. "Do you really think I cannot take care of myself anymore?" Stephanie immediately seized the opportunity to solidify her victory. She placed her hands on my shoulders, her grip firm and patronizing. "I know it is hard to hear, that. But Jace, we honestly believe this is the only way to keep you safe. You need professional care. The facility we found is wonderful. You will be comfortable, and you will not have to worry about maintaining this giant empty house anymore. Let us handle all the complicated legal paperwork. You just need to rest and focus on finding some peace." Marcus chimed in, his voice dripping with that same artificial, sickeningly sweet empathy. "We will pack up your essential clothes and a few nice photographs of Eleanor to take with you to your new room, Robert. You do not need to lift a single finger. We have everything completely under control." He nodded slowly, deliberately, making my movements sluggish and unsure. He raised a trembling hand to my face and rubbed my eyes, pretending to wipe away tears of overwhelmed exhaustion. "I am just so tired," I mumbled softly, letting my words slur together just a fraction. "I am so incredibly tired, Stephanie. I miss your mother so much. Nothing makes any sense without her." "We know, Dad," Stephanie said, patting my shoulder with a hollow, rehearsed affection. "Just go to your room and lie down. We will finish directing the movers and handle the rest of the packing out here. We will wake you when it is time to have dinner." He nodded one last time, turned around, and began to slowly shuffle down the long hallway toward my master bedroom. He dragged my feet across the hardwood floor, making sure my steps sounded heavy and completely defeated. Every fiber of my being wanted to turn around and fight, but my mind kept forcing my body to play the part. He reached my bedroom door, opened it, stepped inside, and gently closed it behind me. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, the frail, confused old man vanished completely. He stood up straight, my breathing steady and my mind razor sharp. He quietly locked the door and placed my heavy leather briefcase securely inside the bottom drawer of my heavy oak dresser, burying it beneath a stack of thick winter sweaters. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of the movers dismantling the rest of my home. He could hear the heavy thud of my furniture being dragged across the floor. I could hear Marcus giving sharp, commanding orders, his fake, sweet voice replaced by his natural, authoritative tone. He sat there in the fading afternoon light, mapping out every possible angle of my defense. He needed solid proof. He needed to uncover the real reason they were rushing to liquidate $1 million asset. These forged power of attorney and the sudden lie about a nursing home were desperate measures. People only resort to desperate, highly illegal measures when they are backed into a terrifying financial corner. He knew Stephanie. He knew she was arrogant and careless. She would leave a digital trail, a paper trail, or a verbal clue. He just needed to find it. He stayed in my bedroom for the rest of the evening. When Marcus eventually knocked on the door to offer me a plate of bland, unseasoned chicken and rice, I accepted it with a weak, grateful smile, maintaining my flawless performance. He left the food mostly untouched, reinforcing their belief that I was rapidly declining. Night eventually fell, covering the chaotic, half-empty house in a thick blanket of heavy silence. Stephanie and Marcus had decided to sleep in the guest room to keep a close eye on the property and, presumably, to keep a close eye on me. I lay awake in my bed for hours, staring up at the dark ceiling, my mind running through complex legal strategies and potential countermeasures. At around 2 in the morning, my throat felt incredibly dry. I carefully threw off the heavy blankets and swung my legs over the side of the bed. He did not turn on any lights. I knew the exact layout of my home perfectly, even in the pitch-black darkness. He silently opened my bedroom door and padded barefoot down the long hallway toward the kitchen. The house felt completely empty and stripped of its soul without the familiar antique furniture filling the spaces. He reached the kitchen and silently filled a glass with cold tap water. As I raised the glass to my lips, a faint flickering light caught my attention. He slowly lowered the glass and looked through the large bay window that overlooked the backyard patio. Standing outside in the cool night air, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of her smartphone screen, was Marcus. He was pacing back and forth across the stone pavers, his arms crossing and uncrossing in frantic, agitated movements. He was whispering furiously into his cell phone, looking over his shoulder every few seconds to make absolutely sure he was completely alone. He pressed my back flat against the cool plaster of the kitchen wall, holding my breath so tightly that my chest began to ache. Marcus was standing just a few feet away on the other side of the glass. The pale moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the cold stone patio. He slowly set my glass of water down on the granite counter, making sure the base did not make the slightest clink. My eyes remained fixed on my son-in-law. He was still pacing, his movements sharp and entirely erratic. The soft blue light from his smartphone screen illuminated his face, highlighting an intense, almost manic expression that I had never seen him wear during the day. He needed to know what was causing him so much profound panic in the middle of the night. He silently crept closer to the bay window. The old wooden frame had a slight gap near the bottom latch, a tiny structural flaw I had meant to fix last summer. He carefully placed my fingers on the brass handle and applied just enough upward pressure to crack the window open a fraction of an inch more. The cool night breeze instantly slipped into the dark kitchen, carrying with it the faint, muffled sound of his hushed and secretive voice. He strained my ears, closing my eyes to focus entirely on the fragmented audio. He could not make out the exact words he was speaking. The rustling wind through the oak trees in the backyard masked the specific details of his frantic conversation. But I could distinctly hear the sharp, aggressive tone of his delivery. He was not talking to Stephanie. The cadence of his voice was completely wrong for a conversation with his wife. It sounded defensive, almost pleading at certain moments, and then immediately snapping back with a harsh, demanding edge. It sounded exactly like a high-stakes negotiation rapidly falling apart. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head vigorously as he listened to whatever the person on the other end of the line was telling him. He watched him end the call abruptly, his fingers trembling slightly as he shoved the phone deep into the pocket of his sleek blazer. He stood completely still for a moment, staring out into the dark expanse of the manicured lawn as if he were waiting for something to jump out from the thick shadows. Then he let out a long, ragged breath and reached into his other pocket. What he pulled out made my blood run entirely cold. It was a familiar bright orange plastic bottle. He recognized the label instantly. It was the expensive premium memory supplement that Marcus had so graciously purchased for me earlier that week. He had handed it to me with such a sweet, caring smile, telling me that the natural vitamins would help clear away the heavy mental fog caused by my deep grief. He had even bought a weekly pill organizer, carefully sorting the capsules for me so I would not have to worry about remembering my daily dosage. He watched in paralyzed horror as he unscrewed the cap of the orange bottle. He did not take a pill for himself. Instead, he walked over to the edge of the patio, right where Eleanor used to plant her rose bushes. Marcus crouched down, opened the plastic bottle, and began pulling apart the large gelatin capsules one by one. He deliberately tipped the capsules upside down, dumping the fine, natural herbal powder directly into the dark, damp garden dirt. He did this methodically, emptying capsule after capsule until there was a small mound of discarded powder hidden beneath the rose bushes. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer calculated madness of his actions. Why would he empty out the expensive supplements he had insisted I take every single morning? The answer to that terrifying question came a few seconds later. Marcus stood back up and pulled a small, clear Ziploc bag from the inside pocket of his blazer. Even from my completely hidden and secure vantage point inside the pitch-black, silent kitchen, I could clearly see that the bag was filled with a strange, crushed white powder. It did not look like any commercial medication I had ever seen. It looked incredibly crude, choky, and entirely unnatural to my eyes. He smoothly placed the empty gelatin capsules on the flat surface of the stone patio table. His hands moved with a chilling, practiced precision. He carefully scooped the crushed white powder from the Ziploc bag, meticulously refilling each and every empty capsule with the unknown substance. He was completely focused. His eyes narrowed in intense concentration as he packed the toxic powder tightly into the innocent-looking pills. He snapped the two halves of the gelatin capsules back together, sealing the deadly, sinister secret safely inside. It was silently manufacturing a lethal weapon right in my very own backyard. He watched him wipe the excess white dust from his fingers, brushing it casually onto his expensive slacks. He took the freshly filled capsules and carefully placed them one by one into the plastic compartments of my weekly pill organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. He systematically filled every single slot with the dangerously contaminated medication, making sure each dose looked completely identical to the original herbal vitamins. A massive, overwhelming wave of profound, debilitating nausea violently washed over me as the horrible, twisted truth finally clicked securely into its proper place in my mind. The heavy mental fog, the intense lethargy, the strange, frightening gaps in my short-term memory over the past 3 agonizing months. It was not the natural, expected byproduct of my profound, overwhelming grief. It was not my 72-year-old brain slowly shutting down from the severe trauma of losing my wife. It was cold, calculated chemistry. It was poison running through my veins. They were intentionally drugging me to fabricate the exact medical symptoms they needed to seamlessly execute their legal takeover. They were destroying my mind from the inside out so that when the doctors examined me, the diagnosis of severe cognitive decline would become completely undeniable, permanent, and legally binding. Marcus snapped the plastic lid of the pill organizer shut with a sharp, sudden click that echoed loudly in the quiet night air. He confidently tucked the empty Ziploc bag back into the inside pocket of his blazer, picked up the organizer, and turned around to head back toward the house. He immediately pushed myself away from the window, retreating silently into the darkest, hidden corner of the kitchen, pressing my entire body flat against the cold metal of the refrigerator. He held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut in sheer panic as the heavy sliding glass door slowly slid open, and he stepped confidently onto the kitchen tiles. He could hear his soft, steady footsteps moving deliberately past me, passing just a few incredibly short feet away in the absolute darkness. He walked back inside and set the pill organizer on the counter. He realized I was not losing my mind. My young family was actively trying to poison my brain. I stayed pressed against the cold metal of the refrigerator for what felt like hours after Marcus left the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, rhythmic intensity. The terrifying reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was not a grieving widower suffering from a tragic cognitive decline. He was a target. My young daughter and son-in-law were systematically poisoning my mind to forcefully seize my assets. He did not sleep a single wink that night. He lay stiffly in my bed, staring at the ceiling, carefully calculating my next physical movements. When morning finally broke, pouring pale sunlight through my bedroom blinds, I knew exactly what I had to do. I shuffled into the kitchen, wearing my most worn-out robe, heavily dragging my feet. Marcus was standing by the marble island, sipping a fresh cup of coffee. He offered me a bright, cheerful morning greeting and slid the plastic pill organizer toward me. I picked up the small, toxic capsule with trembling fingers. I raised a glass of water to my lips, placed the pill inside my mouth, and took a large, loud gulp. Marcus watched me closely, a flicker of dark satisfaction dancing in his eyes as he believed I had ingested the poison. But I had smoothly tucked the capsule deep under my tongue. The moment he turned his back to check his phone, I spat the dissolving capsule into a paper napkin and shoved it deep into the pocket of my robe. Stephanie came downstairs a few minutes later, adjusting her expensive silk tie. They kissed each other goodbye, offered me a few fake, patronizing words of comfort, and finally walked out the front door. He stood by the front window, holding my breath as I watched their luxury sedan pull out of the driveway and disappear down the quiet suburban street. The moment their car turned the final corner, the pathetic, broken old man act completely vanished. My posture straightened. The lingering mental fog that had plagued me for weeks was already beginning to lift, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of a seasoned engineer. He immediately turned around and marched straight down the hallway toward Stephanie's home office. The room was meticulously organized, filled with modern, minimalist furniture that Eleanor had always absolutely hated. Seating in the very center of his sleek glass desk was her high-end, custom-built desktop computer. Stephanie was incredibly arrogant, but she was not nearly as smart as she believed herself to be. He was the one who had physically sourced and assembled every single internal component of that powerful machine for her last Christmas. More importantly, I knew the deeply ingrained, predictable patterns of her mind. Stephanie always thought she was outsmarting everyone around her, but she relied on lazy, repetitive logic. He sat down in her expensive leather office chair and tapped the keyboard. The large monitor flared to life, displaying a password prompt over a high-resolution background image of a tropical beach. He did not hesitate. He typed in the name of her childhood dog, followed by the year she graduated from her prestigious business school. The screen instantly unlocked, granting me unrestricted access to the deepest, darkest corners of her digital life. My hands flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. The very first thing I needed, I sat in Stephanie's expensive leather office chair, my fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced precision. The first thing I needed to verify was the luxury nursing home they had so confidently promised me. I opened her primary web browser and accessed her detailed search history. I meticulously filtered the vast logs for the past 3 months, looking for any combination of words related to elderly care, premium assisted living, or medical facilities. I combed through hundreds of digital footprints. There was absolutely nothing. They had not spent a single second researching a safe place for me to live. The glossy brochure Marcus had placed on the coffee table was nothing more than a cheap theatrical prop designed to manipulate me into submission. I broadened my search parameters, diving deeper into her daily internet activity. What I found instead made my jaw tightly clench. Stephanie's browser history was completely flooded with extensive research into offshore banking regulations, anonymous shell companies, and expedited citizenship applications for Caribbean nations. She had spent hours poring over detailed listings for sprawling beachfront villas in the Bahamas and browsing the rental rates for massive luxury yachts. The digital trail painted a terrifying picture of a woman who was actively preparing to flee the country with a massive sum of liquid cash. I opened a new tab and quickly bypassed the weak security on her personal financial dashboard. The screen populated with a staggering list of her active accounts, and the sheer volume of red numbers instantly validated every dark suspicion I harbored. Stephanie and Marcus were completely drowning in an ocean of catastrophic debt. They had maxed out multiple high-limit credit cards on lavish vacations, designer wardrobes, and fine dining. But the most alarming discovery was a glaring final notice from an unregulated offshore lending firm. The aggressive, threatening language in the digital document detailed a massive, deeply delinquent loan of $900,000. They had leveraged their entire future on high-risk speculative investments that had clearly imploded, leaving them entirely at the mercy of incredibly dangerous people. They were not forcing me out of my home simply because they were greedy. They were sacrificing my life because they were desperate, cornered animals trying to save their own skins from a syndicate that would not hesitate to destroy them. They needed the $1.8 million from the sale of my house to pay off the terrifying debt and fund their cowardly escape to a tropical paradise, leaving me completely abandoned in a bleak, windowless state-run asylum. My chest heaved with a cold, calculated fury as I minimized the financial dashboard. I needed to see exactly how far along they were in this sickening process. I opened her primary email client, bypassing another simple password, and navigated straight to her private inbox. I bypassed her daily work correspondence and sorted the incoming messages by attachments. My eyes immediately locked onto a highly active, ongoing email thread between Stephanie and an unknown, unlisted email address. I clicked on the conversation thread. The contact name simply read, Broker. There was no official agency listed, no professional signature, and absolutely no corporate company logo to verify his identity. It was clearly a deeply shady, unlicensed real estate contact operating entirely under the table to move properties rapidly. He slowly scrolled down to the very first urgent message Stephanie had sent him late last night. It was sent right around the exact same time I had watched Marcus pacing frantically on the backyard patio, clutching his phone in the dark. My eyes quickly scanned the cruel, ruthless words she had hastily typed out in the message body, and my blood instantly turned completely to ice as I realized her ultimate plan. They were pushing forward with absolute ruthlessness, and they were fully preparing to execute the devastating final phase of their terrifying betrayal before the upcoming weekend even officially arrived. The message was brief, cold, and entirely devoid of any human empathy. She had written, List the house 30% below market value immediately. We do not care about getting a fair price. We need the cash by this Friday. No exceptions. Do not worry about the current owner. The old man is too heavily medicated to know what he is signing anyway. The sheer callousness of her message struck me like a physical blow to the chest. She was not just plotting to steal my home. She was actively mocking my perceived mental decline, treating my life as nothing more than a convenient, disposable stepping stone to save her own skin. I sat in Stephanie's expensive leather office chair, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My young daughter, the girl I had raised with every ounce of love and dedication I possessed, had brought this ruthless, calculating man into our family. Together, they had meticulously orchestrated a plan to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my future. They were willing to discard me in a windowless, low-income asylum just to cover up their catastrophic financial mistakes. The betrayal ran so deep it felt like a jagged knife twisting violently in my gut. I read the terrible email one more time, burning every single word into my memory. I needed to remember this exact feeling of profound violation. I needed to use this intense burning anger to fuel my next sequence of actions. I reached out and carefully closed the email client, making absolutely sure I did not alter the read status of the message. I cleared the browser history of my own search queries, meticulously covering my digital tracks so Stephanie would never suspect that her insecure computer had been compromised. I locked the desktop screen, restoring the bright tropical beach background to its original state. I stood up from the desk, my legs feeling slightly unsteady as the massive weight of their deception pressed down on my shoulders. I walked out of the home office and stepped back into the wide, quiet hallway. The house felt incredibly empty and foreign to me now. It was no longer the warm, loving sanctuary where Eleanor and I had shared so many beautiful decades together. It had become a hostile, dangerous battleground. I needed to formulate a solid counterattack, and I needed to do it with extreme speed. Fraida was only 2 days away. That gave me less than 48 hours to completely dismantle their terrifying scheme and secure my own safety. I began to pace slowly across the remaining rugs in the living room, my mind churning through complex legal strategies and potential escape routes. I had the $500,000 in cash, and I had the Montana ranch deed. I possessed the financial firepower to destroy their plans, but I needed a ruthless, impenetrable legal shield to execute my strike. As I turned toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, the sudden sharp chime of the front doorbell shattered the heavy silence of the house. I froze in my tracks. Stephanie and Marcus were at work. We were not expecting any deliveries, and the movers had completely finished their preliminary packing the previous afternoon. I cautiously walked toward the foyer, my heart beginning to race with a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. I approached the heavy wooden front door and peered through the small, distorted glass peephole. Standing on my front porch was a massive, incredibly imposing man. He was wearing a dark leather jacket over a plain black t-shirt, and his thick neck was completely covered in dark, aggressive tattoos. He did not look like a salesman, and he certainly did not look like a friendly neighborhood visitor. He looked like raw, unfiltered violence. I hesitated, my hand hovering nervously over the brass deadbolt. I considered ignoring the bell, hoping he would simply walk away and leave me in peace. But the man reached out and pounded his heavy fist against the solid wood, the loud booming sound echoing violently through the empty foyer. "I know you are in there," a deep, gravelly voice barked through the thick door. "Open up right now, or I will kick this entire frame off its hinges." My breath caught in my throat. I am a 72-year-old man. I am in decent physical shape for my age, but I am absolutely no match for a giant, aggressive thug. However, I also knew that hiding in the shadows like a frightened child would not solve anything. He unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the front door open, leaving the sturdy chain lock securely fastened. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, forcing my voice to remain as calm and steady as possible. The tattooed man did not bother with pleasantries. He slammed his heavy boot violently against the bottom of the door, snapping the metal chain lock as if it were made of cheap plastic. The door flew open, knocking me backward into the foyer. He stumbled and fell hard against the hallway wall, my shoulder colliding painfully with the decorative wooden molding. Before I could even catch my breath, the massive man stepped inside my home and slammed the front door shut behind him. It closed the distance between us in two long, predatory strides. It reached out with a massive, calloused hand and grabbed me forcefully by the collar of my worn bathrobe. It hoisted me up against the wall, his thick fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. It leaned in incredibly close. He could smell the harsh, acrid scent of stale tobacco and cheap cologne radiating from his clothes. It did not care that I was an elderly, defenseless man. It looked at me with a cold, that expression that sent a genuine spike of primal terror straight down my spine. "You must be Stephanie's father," the man snarled, his deep voice vibrating with absolute terrifying menace. "You are going to deliver a very urgent message to your pathetic, cowardly daughter for me." He struggled to breathe, my toes barely touching the hardwood floor as he pinned me against the wall. "I do not know what you are talking about," I gasped out, my hands instinctively gripping his thick wrists. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that held absolutely no humor. He leaned in even closer, his dark, dangerous eyes narrowing into ruthless slits. "Tell your daughter her offshore bets are officially due," he hissed, every single word dripping with lethal intent. "She thought she could hide her catastrophic losses, but we own her. Do tell her that if we do not get our $900,000 in raw cash by this Friday, we are coming back here. And if we have to come back, this entire house burns down to the ground with you trapped inside it." He released his violent grip on my collar, letting me drop heavily to the floor. He gasped for air, frantically clutching my bruised chest as my rapidly pounding heart hammered against my ribs. The huge man turned around, opened the heavy door, and walked out into the fading sunlight without looking back even once, leaving me completely alone with the terrifying reality of my bleak situation. He pulled myself up from the cold floor, aching from where the tattooed man had slammed me against the wall. The terrifying reality of his threat lingered in the silent foyer like toxic gas. $900,000 by Friday, or the house would burn with me inside. The timeline was incredibly tight, and the danger was intensely physical. He knew I could not stay in Boston for another night. If I confronted Stephanie now, their cartel associates would silence me before I reached the authorities. He needed a fortress and an airtight legal weapon. He adjusted my torn bathrobe and walked back to my bedroom. He packed a small duffel bag and retrieved my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of my oak dresser. He needed an excuse to leave without raising suspicion. When Marcus and Stephanie returned home from work that evening, I was sitting on my bed, staring blankly at a framed photograph of my late brother. He deliberately let my hands shake as they walked in. He looked up with tear-filled eyes and told them I had been thinking heavily about the nursing home. He said I was ready to accept my fate and move into the facility on Friday morning, but I had one desperate request. He told them I needed to take a bus down to Pennsylvania to visit my older brother's grave to say a proper goodbye before I was locked away. Marcus did not hide his immense relief. He eagerly agreed, his eyes lighting up at the prospect of having me out of the house during the crucial days before the fraudulent sale. He pulled out his smartphone and booked me a cheap bus ticket for the very next morning. He told me to take all the time I needed, assuring me they would handle the packing. They thought they were sending a broken, heavily medicated old man on a pathetic final journey. They had no idea they were giving a seasoned engineer the exact window needed to orchestrate their destruction. The following morning, Marcus dropped me off at the downtown bus terminal. He hugged in goodbye, playing the part of the frail elder perfectly. He waited until his sedan disappeared into the city traffic. Then I walked directly to the taxi stand and ordered the driver to take me straight to the international airport. He bypassed the commercial counters and paid for a direct flight to Montana using a private credit card Eleanor and I kept for emergencies. He boarded the plane, gripping my leather briefcase tightly. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, the heavy anxiety crushing me finally dissipated. Hours later, I stood on the edge of the massive property Eleanor had secretly left me. The Montana air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of my suburban home. Stretching out before me were the similacres of rolling plains framed by jagged mountains. I saw the heavy machinery of the Natural Gas Corporation working steadily on the horizon, pumping $75,000 a month into a secure trust my corrupt daughter knew nothing about. I took a deep breath, drawing strength from the vast landscape. He did not linger. He had less than 48 hours to execute my legal strike. He walked into the nearby town, a quiet community built around the local gas industry. He headed straight for the address Eleanor had listed in her hidden documents. The office belonged to Harrison Wright, a highly respected corporate attorney who managed the complex land leases for the estate. He pushed open the glass door and walked into a sleek reception area. He demanded to see Harrison immediately, bypassing the confused receptionist by stating my name and connection to Eleanor's private trust. Harrison Wright was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, wearing a tailored suit that radiated ruthless efficiency. He welcomed me into his spacious corner office, offering sincere condolences for Eleanor's recent passing, but I did not have the time to exchange polite pleasantries. He sat down in the leather chair across from his massive desk and placed my briefcase squarely between us. He popped the brass latches and opened the lid. I watched Harrison's professional composure slip for a fraction of a second as he stared at the $500,000 in bound raw cash sitting next to the original property deed. He looked him directly in the eye and laid out the entire terrifying situation. He told him about the forged power of attorney document, the fake nursing home brochure, and the unlicensed real estate broker Marcus was using to quickly liquidate my home. He explained the massive offshore debt my daughter had accumulated and the violent cartel enforcer who threatened to burn my house to the ground by Friday. I told Harrison that I needed to completely destroy my daughter's legal standing, and I needed to do it in less than 48 hours. Harrison leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together as he processed the complex legal warfare I was proposing. A sad, predatory smile slowly spread across his face. He told me my daughter made a catastrophic error by assuming a forged document would grant her absolute power. Harrison moved with lethal speed. He called his senior paralegal into the office and began issuing rapid, precise instructions. We used a portion of the raw cash to immediately establish an invisible, heavily shielded corporate entity. We named the corporation Apex Holdings. Harrison structured the company using anonymous corporate proxies and blind trusts, ensuring that my name would never publicly appear on any registration documents. Apex Holdings was a ghost, a massive financial entity that could operate with absolute impunity and total secrecy. Once the corporate structure was firmly in place and legally registered with the state authorities, Harrison slid a fresh stack of dense legal transfer documents across the mahogany desk toward me. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He explained that a power of attorney, even a fraudulently notarized one, only grants the proxy the ability to manage assets that are actively owned by the principal individual. If the principal individual no longer owns the asset, the proxy has absolutely nothing left to sell. He took the gold pen and pressed the nib against the thick parchment paper. Right there in his quiet, secure Montana office, I confidently signed my name, legally transferring the entire deed of my $1.8 million Boston home completely out of my personal possession. He gifted the property directly into the impenetrable corporate vault of Apex Holdings. He set the pen down, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute victory wash over my tired bones. The heavy burden of grief and fear that had been slowly crushing my spirit for 3 months was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating sense of ultimate justice. The trap was now fully set, armed, and completely inescapable. He had successfully stripped them of the very last physical asset they desperately needed to survive. Stephanie and Marcus were currently back in Boston, aggressively negotiating with their shady broker, desperately trying to sell a massive house that I no longer legally owned. The flight back to Boston felt completely different from my desperate journey to Montana. He was no longer a terrified, grieving widower running blindly from a dangerous threat. He was a man returning to a battlefield with an impenetrable shield and a loaded weapon. My mind was razor sharp, replaying every legal instruction Harrison Wright had given me. But the moment the taxi pulled up to my suburban driveway, I knew I had to completely bury the engineer and resurrect the broken old man. He let my shoulders sag heavily. He slowed my breathing, dragging my feet across the concrete walkway. When I opened the front door, the house was eerily silent. Most of my belongings were already packed away in sterile cardboard boxes stacked high against the living room walls. Stephanie and Marcus had wasted absolutely no time preparing the property for the new buyers. They were sitting at the kitchen island, huddled over a laptop, but they immediately jumped up when they heard the heavy door click shut. Marcus rushed over to greet me, his face plastered with that familiar, sickeningly sweet mask of artificial empathy. He gently took my small duffel bag from my hands, treating me as if my bones were made of fragile glass. He asked me how the trip to my brother's grave went, tilting his head to simulate profound compassion. He kept my gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards, forcing my voice to tremble just enough to sound thoroughly exhausted. He told him the journey had taken a massive toll on my fragile heart. He muttered something incoherent about how much I missed Eleanor, rubbing my eyes to feign a wave of overwhelming lethargy. Stephanie stepped into the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes scanning my face to verify that the toxic modified pills she thought I was taking were still doing their intended job. I gave her a weak, vacant nod, playing the heavily medicated victim to absolute perfection. "You look incredibly tired, Dad," Stephanie said softly, guiding me by the elbow toward the empty living room. "You should really go lie down and get some rest. But before you go to sleep, we just need you to handle one tiny piece of administrative paperwork. The real estate broker found a wonderful family who wants to buy the house, and we are closing the deal tomorrow morning. We just need your final official consent to push the sale through." Marcus smoothly pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from his sleek leather portfolio. He placed a heavy brass pen on top of the papers and slid them gently across the glass coffee table. He stared down at the bold black letters printing the words "Consent to sell real estate property." My heart hammered against my ribs, but this time it was not out of fear. It was out of pure, unadulterated irony. They were incredibly eager to sell a $1 million asset that had already been securely locked inside a Montana corporate vault 24 hours ago. I reached out for the brass pen, intentionally letting my fingers shake uncontrollably. I gripped the cool metal, hovering the nib over the designated signature line. He looked up at Marcus and Stephanie, my eyes wide and pleading, perfectly simulating the terror of a confused elder signing his life away. Marcus offered a reassuring, maternal nod. He pressed the pen to the paper. Instead of my usual precise, structured signature, I deliberately crafted a messy, jagged, barely legible scrawl. He let the pen slip slightly at the end, creating a clumsy streak of dark blue ink across the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like the desperate, uncoordinated signature of a man whose mind was completely failing him. Stephanie quickly snatched the document off the glass table the very second I lifted the pen. She could not even hide the flash of greedy triumph that instantly illuminated her face. She checked the messy signature, exchanged a highly satisfied glance with Marcus, and carefully tucked the legal papers back into his leather portfolio. They both let out a synchronized breath of profound relief. The major hurdle was clear. They honestly believed they were going to be multimillionaires by tomorrow afternoon. I slowly pushed myself up from the sofa, groaning softly, and began my pathetic, dragging shuffle down the hallway toward my master bedroom. I closed my door, but I did not latch it completely. I left the tiny, microscopic crack open so I could hear the immediate aftermath of my performance. Faint, muffled sounds drifted down the quiet corridor. I heard the distinct, sharp pop of a wine cork being pulled from a bottle. I heard the soft clinking of crystal glasses in the kitchen. They were actively celebrating their victory. They were drinking expensive wine, toasting to their impending wealth, completely oblivious to the massive, inescapable trap that was already tightly closed around their ankles. He waited for an entire hour. He sat perfectly still in the dark, waiting for the house to grow completely silent. I knew they would eventually retreat to the upstairs guest room to finalize their tropical escape plans. When I finally heard their bedroom door click shut on the second floor, I moved. He opened my duffel bag and pulled out a small, highly advanced micro-audio recorder I had purchased from a specialized electronics store in Montana. As an engineer, I always appreciated reliable, high-quality technology. The tiny device was no bigger than a standard coin, equipped with a powerful, long-range directional microphone and a secure Bluetooth transmitter. He slipped out of my bedroom and crept silently back into the dark, empty living room. The moonlight cast long shadows over the stacks of moving boxes. He crawled on my hands and knees across the bare floorboards, making absolutely no sound. He reached the glass coffee table where I had just signed my fake consent forms. I reached underneath the heavy wooden base of the table, found a hidden, recessed groove, and firmly pressed the adhesive side of the extremely small recording device against the wood. It was perfectly concealed, totally invisible from any normal standing or sitting angle in the room. He quickly retreated to my bedroom, locked the door securely, and sat down heavily on the edge of my mattress. He pulled the sleek, wireless Bluetooth receiver from my pocket and placed the small earpiece deeply into my right ear. The technology was flawless. The connection was established instantly, completely free of any static or interference. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed a harsh, bright red in the darkness. It was exactly 2 a.m. He stared at the numbers, feeling a cold, intense wave of anticipation washing over my entire body. He knew Marcus and Stephanie were heavily stressed about their massive debt. He knew they would not be able to sleep tonight. They would inevitably come downstairs to pace the living room and discuss their final desperate strategy for tomorrow morning. He took a deep, steadying breath, letting the absolute silence of the suburban night settle around me. He reached down, firmly pressed my thumb against the small, glowing blue button on the side of the compact receiver, and quietly hit play. I pressed the small, glowing blue button on the side of the wireless receiver and held my breath. For a brief second, there was nothing but the soft, rhythmic hum of digital static. Then the incredibly clear audio feed flooded directly into my right ear. The hidden microphone was exceptionally powerful. I could hear the faint, ambient hum of the living room refrigerator in the background. He could hear the distinct sound of liquid being poured into crystal glasses, followed by the sharp, celebratory clink of a toast. Marcus and Stephanie were sitting right above the hidden device. Their voices were so sharp and immediate that they might as well have been sitting on the edge of my mattress. "I honestly cannot believe we actually pulled this off," Stephanie said, her voice thick with a mixture of profound relief and arrogant triumph. "I thought the old man was going to put up a massive fight today. He thought he was going to actually read every single line of that consent form before he picked up the pen." Marcus let out a short, dismissive laugh. "I told you there was absolutely nothing to worry about, Stephanie. You give him far too much credit. Your father has been completely checked out ever since we increased the dosage in his morning capsules. It could barely even hold the pen straight today. His signature looked like it was drawn by a blind child. The broker did not even question it for a single second. It just saw the ink on the paper and validated the transaction." He heard the soft thud of a glass being set down on the heavy wooden coffee table. "So, what is the exact timeline for tomorrow?" Stephanie asked, her tone shifting into a sharp, business-like cadence. "When does the money actually clear the escrow account? We cannot afford a single delay with these cartel people." That enforcer made it incredibly clear that Friday is our absolute deadline before things get physically violent. "The timeline is absolutely perfect," Marcus replied smoothly. "The buyer is wiring the full $1.8 million directly into our joint offshore account by 9 tomorrow morning. The absolute second the funds clear the international holding period, I am electronically transferring the $900,000 straight to the syndicate's routing number. That completely wipes our massive debt clean. They will have their money a full 24 hours before their Friday deadline. The cartel will back off, and we will finally be completely free." "And the remaining $900,000? Stephanie asked, the greed practically dripping from her eager voice. "That is our fresh start," Marcus said confidently. "I already booked our first-class tickets. We are leaving for the Bahamas on Thursday night." He secured a beautiful, secluded beachfront villa on a long-term lease. "We can live like absolute royalty down there for years while we figure out our next major move. We just need to pack our bags and walk out the front door." There was a brief, comfortable silence on the audio feed as they both likely visualized their upcoming tropical escape. Then Stephanie shifted in her seat. The leather sofa creaked loudly through the earpiece. "What about Dad?" Stephanie asked, her voice completely devoid of any familial affection. She sounded like she was discussing a broken piece of luggage that needed to be hauled to the local dump. "Are we still dropping him off at that low-income nursing home on Thursday afternoon before we head to the airport? We need to make sure he is securely locked away so he cannot wander into a police station and try to report the house sale as fraud when his head finally clears." Marcus let out a high, chilling laugh that sent a massive spike of pure ice straight down my spine. It was a sound of absolute predatory malice. I cancelled the nursing home reservation 3 days ago, Stephanie, Marcus said, his tone dripping with dark amusement. That glossy brochure I left on the coffee table was just a visual prop to keep him docile. We cannot risk putting him in a standard assisted living facility. Even a terrible, underfunded nursing home allows patients to make phone calls, receive visitors, and eventually talk to a social worker. If his heavy medication wears off and he suddenly regains his sharp memory, he could easily cause a massive legal headache for us from a nursing home. So where exactly is he going? Stephanie asked, sounding more curious than concerned. I called the state psychiatric asylum, Marcus revealed coldly. I used the forged power of attorney and the highlighted medical chart from Dr. Harrison to secure an involuntary, permanent commitment order. They are sending a secure medical transport van to pick the old man up first thing on Friday morning. We will already be sitting on a beautiful beach in the Bahamas by the time they arrive to haul him away. The state asylum? Stephanie repeated, a hint of genuine surprise coloring her voice. Is that not a highly restricted lockdown facility? Exactly, Marcus confirmed with ruthless satisfaction. They specialize in severe, unmanageable dementia patients and aggressive psychiatric cases. Once he is admitted into their system, he becomes a permanent ward of the state. He will be stripped of his personal clothing, his phone, and his identity. They will keep him heavily sedated around the clock to manage his fabricated delusions. The specific ward I assigned him to is located in the basement level of their oldest building. There are absolutely no windows in that ward, Stephanie. He will never see the sunlight again, and he will never, ever be able to contact the outside world to tell his pathetic story. He will simply vanish. He sat alone in the crushing darkness of my bedroom, clutching the wireless receiver so tightly that the hard plastic casing dug painfully into my palm. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their master plan was almost entirely incomprehensible. They were not just stealing my home and fleeing the country. They were intentionally condemning me to a living nightmare. They were sentencing me to spend the final years of my life locked inside a windowless concrete cell, pumped full of heavy chemical sedatives until my mind actually did rot away into nothingness. My young flesh and blood had calmly signed my life away for a luxurious vacation in the Bahamas. A deep, terrifying silence settled over me as I listened to them joyfully clink their crystal wine glasses together one more time in the kitchen. He thought the absolute worst of their betrayal had already been completely and fully exposed. He honestly thought there was absolutely nothing else left in this entire world that could possibly shock me or break my heart any further. But the quiet, hushed conversation echoing continuously through my earpiece did not end with their incredibly sinister asylum plan. The digital audio feed crackled slightly as Stephanie leaned closer to her husband, lowering her voice into a tight, incredibly nervous whisper. The final, deeply devastating secret was about to abruptly drop into the silence, and it would completely shatter my soul forever. He sat on my mattress. He pressed the earpiece deeper into my ear, straining to catch every single syllable. The ambient noise in the living room seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp, nervous friction of Stephanie shifting her weight on the leather sofa. When she finally spoke again, her voice was no longer filled with the arrogant triumph of a woman who had just successfully stolen her father's estate. It was trembling, frail, and heavy with a sudden, suffocating paranoia. "What about Mom?" Stephanie whispered, the question hanging in the air like a thick, poisonous fog. What if Dr. Harrison ever says something to him? What if Dad ever finds out what we actually did? My heart skipped a violent beat. My breathing stopped entirely. He sat perfectly still in the crushing darkness of my bedroom, my entire body going rigid with an instinctual, primal dread. He had no idea what she was talking about. Eleanor had passed away from a sudden, aggressive illness. It was a tragedy, a terrible twist of fate that had broken my world into a million pieces. There was nothing for me to find out. "Keep your voice down," Marcus hissed, his tone instantly dropping into a harsh, venomous warning. "No one is ever going to find out anything, Stephanie. You are letting your nerves get the absolute best of you. Dr. Harrison is not going to say a single word. He is legally bound by hospital confidentiality, and he honestly believes we were just following her advanced medical directives." "But we were not following her directives," Stephanie stammered, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She was trying to communicate with the nurses. She was trying to stay awake. What if Dad eventually requests the detailed medical logs? What if he ever finds out we authorized the hospital administration to unplug her ventilator 2 days early just so she could not sign her new will? The digital audio feed continued to broadcast their hushed conversation, but I could no longer hear the words over the deafening roaring sound of my own blood rushing through my ears. The bedroom began to physically spin around me. I felt a massive, suffocating weight slam directly into my chest, stealing all the oxygen from my lungs. I reached out and gripped the edge of my heavy oak nightstand, my fingers digging desperately into the wood to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. I closed my eyes, and a vivid, excruciatingly painful memory instantly flooded my mind. I remembered the sterile, glaring fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. I remembered sitting beside Eleanor's hospital bed, holding her frail, cold hand for hours on end. She had been weak, fighting a massive infection that ravaged her body, but she had been fighting. I remembered the exact moment the attending physician had pulled me aside in the quiet hallway. He had looked at me with deep sympathy and told me that her organs were completely failing, that keeping her on the mechanical ventilator was only prolonging her profound suffering. He had trusted that medical assessment completely. He had wept uncontrollably, believing that letting her go was the final, merciful act of a loving husband. He remembered the cold chill of the hospital room as I held her hand one last time, begging her for forgiveness for not being able to save her from the pain. He had kissed her forehead, told her how much I loved her, and stood by in absolute agony as the nurses silenced the machines and allowed her to slip away into the dark, but that was a lie. It was all a massive, carefully orchestrated, sickening lie. She was going to change her estate planning, Stephanie, Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of any human soul. She told me her lawyer was coming to the hospital on Thursday morning to draft a new living trust. She was going to lock the majority of her liquid assets into a secure generation-skipping fund for any future grandchildren. She was going to completely cut off our direct access to the primary inheritance accounts. We could not afford to let that happen. We needed that upfront capital to satisfy the first round of offshore margin calls. If she had signed those new documents, we would have been completely ruined. "I know," Stephanie whispered, her voice trembling with a cowardice that made me physically ill. "I know why we had to do it. But it was still my mother, Marcus." We walked into that administrative office, claimed Dad was too emotionally compromised to make the hard medical choices, and we used our emergency proxy to sign the termination orders. We killed her. "We did not kill her," Marcus snapped back, his tone radiating pure, unadulterated evil. Her body was already failing. We simply expedited the inevitable process to protect our financial future. It was a difficult business decision, Stephanie, and it worked. We got the inheritance payout. We secured the house. And now we are leaving for the Caribbean. You need to bury that guilt right now. The old man is being shipped to a windowless asylum on Friday morning. There is absolutely no one left to ask any questions. He slowly opened my eyes. The suffocating wave of profound grief that had been drowning me for 3 months evaporated into the cold, silent air of the bedroom. The terrible, gnawing sadness of losing my wife was instantly burned away by a blazing, catastrophic inferno of absolute rage. The intense burning fury coursing through my veins was so incredibly powerful that it made my hands stop shaking. My mind achieved a terrifying, flawless clarity. He was no longer a mourning widower. He was a man who had just uncovered a murder. He had spent my entire life working tirelessly to provide a beautiful, comfortable world for my daughter. He had sacrificed my own dreams, working grueling hours on dangerous construction sites just to make sure she never had to experience a single day of hardship. He had loved her with every fiber of my being. But the woman sitting in my living room, drinking my expensive wine and planning a tropical vacation, was no longer my daughter. She was a monster. She was a ruthless, calculating predator who had partnered with a sociopath to systematically destroy his own family for money. They had weaponized my profound love for my wife. They had taken advantage of my debilitating grief to slowly poison my mind, intending to lock me inside a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life, stripping me of every fundamental human right I possessed just to cover their tracks. But that was only the secondary crime. The true depth of their depravity was so much worse than anything I could have ever possibly imagined. The financial fraud, the fake nursing home, the stolen house, it all paled in comparison to the horrifying truth echoing in my ear. My blood turned to ice. They did not just abandon me to save themselves from a violent cartel debt. They actively shortened my wife's life to secure their inheritance window before it permanently closed. She was brain dead. Stephanie, Marcus snapped back on the recording, his voice echoing with a sickening, metallic hollow that stripped away any remaining trace of his humanity. Keeping her alive on those machines was costing us thousands of dollars a day in specialized care that insurance was already threatening to deny. She was never going to wake up. And more importantly, her prolonged lingering gave us the absolute perfect window to secure the power of attorney. While your father was entirely too busy crying at her bedside to notice what he was signing, we made the right call. We did what had to be done to protect our assets. He sat motionless in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom. The earpiece delivered his cruel, calculated words straight into my mind, but they no longer felt like a heavy, blunt impact. Instead, they felt like a sudden plunge into freezing Arctic water. Every single trace of the debilitating grief that had weighed down my shoulders for the past 3 months completely evaporated. The overwhelming, crushing sorrow of losing my wife was instantly eradicated, burned away by a cold, clinical, and absolutely terrifying clarity. He was no longer a mourning father. He was no longer a confused, broken old man waiting to be shipped away to a windowless asylum. I was a structural engineer. He had spent 40 years of my professional life analyzing catastrophic failures, identifying weak points in massive structures, and systematically dismantling immense projects under extreme pressure. I closed my eyes and allowed the analytical, predatory side of my brain to fully awaken. He stopped viewing Stephanie as my flesh and blood. I stripped away the decades of fatherly affection, the memories of teaching her how to ride a bicycle, the pride of paying for her expensive business school. I forcefully severed all emotional ties to the girl I had raised, actively reducing her and her ruthless husband to nothing more than a highly dangerous, unstable variable in a complex mathematical equation. They were a critical failure, and I listened to the rest of their hushed conversation with absolute unwavering detachment. Stephanie eventually stopped whining about her fabricated guilt, her shallow conscience easily pacified by Marcus's venomous reassurances. They went back to eagerly discussing the specific layout of their luxurious beachfront villa in the Bahamas, debating whether they should hire a private chef or rely on local catering once they arrived. They clinked their wine glasses one final time, the sharp chime of the crystal sealing their horrifying pact. He heard the heavy squeak of the leather sofa as they finally stood up, followed by the soft padding of their footsteps ascending the carpeted staircase to the guest room. He waited until I heard their bedroom door firmly click shut on the second floor. He slowly reached up and pulled the wireless Bluetooth earpiece from my ear, setting it gently on the edge of the heavy oak nightstand. The silence that rushed back into my bedroom was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt charged with a vibrant, lethal electric current. He stood up from my mattress. My joints did not ache. My muscles did not tremble. He walked over to the large bay window and pulled the heavy curtains tightly shut, ensuring that no stray light from the street lamps outside could illuminate my movements. He had a significant amount of work to do before the sun rose, and I needed to execute every single step with absolute unforgiving precision. He moved silently around the perimeter of my bedroom, packing a sleek leather overnight bag with the few essential items I would need for the next 48 hours. I folded my crisp, tailored charcoal suit, carefully placing it into a protective garment bag. I selected a pristine white dress shirt and a dark, conservative tie. He was not going to face them tomorrow morning looking like a ragged, exhausted victim. He was going to walk into the closing room looking like an executive executioner. I retrieved my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of the dresser, ensuring that the remaining bundles of raw cash, the official Montana Ranch documents, and the freshly minted corporate records for Apex Holdings were completely secure. He locked the brass latches with a satisfying metallic snap. He spent the remaining hours of the night sitting perfectly still in a high-backed reading chair in the corner of my bedroom. He did not sleep for a single second. He mentally rehearsed the upcoming confrontation, calculating every possible variable, anticipating every potential reaction from my corrupt daughter and her treacherous husband. I mapped out the exact timing of Harrison Wright's arrival, the strategic positioning of the federal agents, and the precise moment I would drop the heavy, inescapable hammer on their entire existence. He was going to rip their glamorous, deceitful lives apart, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there was absolutely nothing left but the terrifying realization of their own catastrophic failure. The digital clock on my nightstand slowly ticked forward, the bright red numbers marking the final hours of their stolen freedom. Eventually, the pitch-black sky outside my window began to soften into a pale, bruised purple. The quiet suburban neighborhood slowly woke up, completely oblivious to the massive, life-altering explosion that was about to detonate. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps moving around on the second floor. The shower in the guest bathroom clicked on, the water rushing loudly through the pipes behind the walls. Stephanie and Marcus were awake. He remained perfectly hidden in the shadows of my locked bedroom, listening as they confidently prepared for the most important day of their miserable lives. He could smell the rich scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting down the long hallway. He heard Marcus humming a cheerful melody as he moved around the kitchen island. They were entirely ignorant of the massive trap that was already tightly closed around their necks. They honestly believed that today they would collect their stolen millions, pay off the violent cartel enforcer, and board a first-class flight to a tropical paradise while I rotted away in a dark concrete cell. The heavy front door clicked open and slammed shut. He peeked through the narrow slit in my bedroom blinds. The morning sun was bright and clear. Stephanie and Marcus were striding confidently down the concrete driveway. They were both dressed impeccably in sharp, tailored designer suits, carrying sleek leather portfolios, their faces radiating an aura of absolute arrogance. They climbed into their luxury sedan and backed out into the street, heading straight to the real estate broker's office to collect their final massive payout. The moment their car turned the corner and disappeared from view, I grabbed my things, stepped out into the hallway, and prepared to follow them. It was closing day, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the final door closed directly on them. I stepped out of the dark shadows of my home and walked down the quiet suburban street to where I had parked my rental car the night before. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I kept a safe, deliberate distance behind Stephanie and Marcus as their luxury sedan navigated the early morning commute toward the bustling city. The drive took just under an hour, but to me it felt like an eternity suspended in pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I watched their vehicle weave effortlessly through the dense Boston traffic, moving closer and closer to the downtown financial district. My hands rested steadily on the steering wheel. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of a father about to destroy his only child. The man driving this car was a structural engineer actively preparing a controlled, devastating demolition. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the cold, sterile hospital room where they had heartlessly silenced her life support machines just to protect their greedy, desperate financial timeline. That single, horrific memory completely solidified the cold steel in my spine. They were going to pay dearly for every single precious second they stole from her. They finally pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, modern high-rise building located right in the beating heart of the city. He parked a level above them, waited a few calculated moments, and took the elevator up to the main lobby. The real estate brokerage firm occupied the entire 14th floor. It was an incredibly ostentatious office, clearly designed to project immense wealth and success to high-net-worth clients. The walls were lined with abstract modern art, and the floors were polished white marble that brilliantly reflected the bright morning sunlight streaming through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. He stepped off the elevator and stood quietly near a large decorative potted plant, observing the main reception area from a secure, safe distance. Through the thick glass walls of the primary conference room, I could clearly see Stephanie and Marcus. They were sitting side by side at a massive mahogany table. Marcus was nervously crossing and uncrossing his legs, his stylish high heel tapping rapidly against the thick carpet. Stephanie was constantly checking her expensive gold wristwatch, her face a tight mask of barely contained frantic anticipation. They were eagerly waiting for the anonymous buyer to walk through that heavy glass door and hand them a certified cashier's check for $1.8 million. They honestly, truly believed their terrifying nightmare was over forever. I pulled my smartphone from my inner jacket pocket and checked the digital time. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The official closing was scheduled for 9. He looked toward the main elevator bank at the far end of the expansive marble lobby. The polished metal doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. Harrison Wright stepped out into the bright hallway. He was wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, holding his sleek leather briefcase firmly in his right hand. He looked like an apex predator entering a shallow pool filled with incredibly vulnerable prey. He spotted me immediately and offered a sharp, curt nod of silent acknowledgement. We had spent the last 48 hours aggressively coordinating this exact moment down to the very last second. He had contacted the appropriate federal authorities the very moment he secured the legal transfer of my property into the impenetrable Montana corporate vault. We had provided them with undeniable, concrete proof of the forged power of attorney, the attempted wire fraud, and the ongoing malicious conspiracy to sell a stolen, high-value asset across state lines. The trap was no longer just a messy civil dispute over family money. It was a massive, airtight federal crime with incredibly severe legal consequences. He took a deep, fortifying breath and smoothed the crisp lapels of my dark charcoal suit. He adjusted my silk tie, ensuring my physical posture was absolutely rigid and commanding. He was no longer the hunched, chuffing, heavily medicated victim they had left behind in the kitchen just 2 hours ago. He walked out from behind the decorative plant and strode purposefully across the gleaming white marble floor. My polished dress shoes clicked sharply against the stone, creating a steady, rhythmic march toward justice. I approached the clear, glass-walled conference room with unwavering determination. The young, unlicensed real estate broker was sitting at the head of the long table, hastily organizing a thick stack of final closing documents. Stephanie and Marcus were leaning forward in their plush seats, their eager eyes fixed hungrily on the frosted glass door, completely ready to welcome the wealthy buyer who was about to miraculously save their lives. He reached out and firmly grasped the heavy stainless steel handle. I turned the handle slowly and pushed the thick door wide open. The heavy glass swung inward with a smooth, silent glide. He stepped confidently into the bright conference room and let the heavy door slowly close behind me with a soft, definitive click. The sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolutely palpable. The polite, welcoming, perfectly rehearsed smile on Marcus's face completely shattered the very second his dark eyes landed on my tailored suit. Stephanie physically jumped in her leather chair, a loud, sharp gasp escaping her throat, as if all the oxygen had been violently punched directly out of her lungs. They stared at me in total, unadulterated horror. They were looking at a ghost. They were looking at the frail, heavily medicated old man they firmly believed they had securely locked away in a suburban kitchen, completely unaware that he had just transformed into their absolute worst nightmare. He did not say a single word. He simply stood at the end of the long mahogany table, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and my hands resting calmly at my sides. He locked my eyes directly onto Stephanie. This sheer, naked panic radiating from her pale, trembling face was incredibly satisfying to witness. She opened her mouth to speak, to stammer out some pathetic, fabricated excuse for why I was standing there, but her vocal cords completely failed her. The profound, suffocating silence in the room was entirely deafening. The unlicensed broker looked back and forth between us, entirely confused by the sudden, terrifying tension that had just hijacked his highly lucrative morning. He watched Marcus slowly reach into his designer purse, his shaking fingers frantically searching for his cell phone, realizing that their brilliant, flawless escape plan had just encountered a massive catastrophic failure. It was desperately looking for a quick, invisible way out of the terrifying situation they had so carelessly created for themselves. But there was absolutely no escape from the relentless, crushing gravity of their horrifying crimes. I held my gaze steady, letting them drown completely in their own sudden, overwhelming terror. And then the heavy stainless steel handle of the conference room door turned for a second time. Right behind me stood Harrison Wright, holding a sleek leather briefcase, flanked by 2 fully armed federal agents. The glass door clicked shut behind the federal agents, sealing the room like a vault. Stephanie remained frozen in her expensive leather chair, her jaw hanging slightly open as her mind desperately struggled to process the impossible scene. She looked from me to the federal agents and back to me, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, coming out as a stammer. She raised her trembling hands, gesturing wildly toward the briefcase resting on the mahogany table. She asked what was going on, her voice cracking under her sudden panic. She looked at Marcus silently, begging him to deploy a manipulative laugh, but he was completely paralyzed. The arrogant aura he possessed just 10 minutes ago had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw terror. The unlicensed real estate broker pushed his chair back violently, the metal legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. He held his hands up in absolute surrender, rapidly muttering that he had no idea what was happening and was just an independent contractor. He swore he knew absolutely nothing about any underlying criminal activity. Harrison Wright ignored the panicking broker entirely. He walked with a calm, predatory grace toward the head of the long conference table, his polished dress shoes silent on the thick carpet. He placed his sleek leather briefcase down on the smooth mahogany surface and popped the brass latches with a sharp snap. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized legal file. He did not look at Stephanie or Marcus with anger. He looked at them with the cold, clinical detachment of an exterminator examining a severe pest problem. He tossed the heavy file onto the center of the table. The thick stack of papers slid across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from Marcus's trembling hands. Harrison adjusted his tailored suit jacket and cleared his throat, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He spoke with a deep, resonant voice that carried the undeniable weight of absolute legal authority. "Allow me to formally introduce my client," he began, gesturing respectfully toward me. "You may know him as your father, but in the professional financial sector, he is recognized as the sole proprietor and acting chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." Stephanie stared at Harrison in profound confusion, her brow deeply furrowed as her panicked brain desperately tried to connect the dots. She repeated the name Apex Holdings out loud, the unfamiliar corporate title tasting like ash in her mouth. Marcus swallowed hard, his dark eyes darting frantically toward the heavy file resting on the table. Harrison offered them a sharp, humorless smile. He calmly explained that Apex Holdings was a privately managed investment firm with a significant amount of liquid capital available for immediate deployment. He stated that earlier this week, Apex Holdings utilized its corporate channels to reach out to a specific unregulated offshore lending entity. Harrison leaned forward, placing both of his hands flat on the mahogany table. Apex Holdings just legally purchased your delinquent $900,000 debt directly from the underground syndicate via secure corporate channels, he announced, letting the sheer magnitude of his words hang heavily in the silent room. "We bought your paper at a premium to ensure a rapid, unquestioned transfer of financial liability. The dangerous men who were threatening to burn you alive are no longer looking for you. You no longer owe them a single dime." For a brief, agonizingly stupid second, a profound wave of relief washed over Stephanie's pale face. She actually believed that I had intervened to save his miserable life. She thought that the pathetic, forgiving father she had constantly manipulated had rushed in at the very last minute to financially rescue her from his catastrophic mistakes. She let out a long, shaky breath and looked up at me with fresh tears welling in her cowardly eyes. But Harrison Wright was not finished delivering the devastating sequence of perfectly timed explosions. He reached out and tapped his index finger sharply against the top page of the legal file. "However," Harrison continued, his tone dropping into a lethal, icy register. "Because Apex Holdings absorbed your financial liability, we are now your sole exclusive creditors. And unfortunately, we demand immediate total repayment in full." Marcus finally found his voice, though it sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. He pointed a shaking finger at the closing documents spread across the table. He aggressively stated that they were closing on the house right now and they would securely have the cash to pay the debt in less than an hour. Harrison let out a short, sharp laugh that lacked any warmth. He shook his head slowly, looking at Marcus with genuine, unadulterated pity. That is where you have encountered a massive, insurmountable legal dilemma, he said smoothly. You see, you cannot legally sell a property that you do not actually own. Marcus' face instantly went completely pale. All the blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically ill. He stammered that he had a valid, notarized power of attorney document that explicitly granted his wife the legal right to liquidate her father's primary estate. Harrison nodded in polite agreement, conceding that his forged document might have functioned perfectly under different circumstances. But the power of attorney only applies to assets currently held by the principal individual. Harrison explained, his voice ringing with absolute finality. M.A.R. Robert legally transferred the entire deed of his suburban Boston property out of his personal name nearly a month ago. He gifted the entire estate completely into the impenetrable corporate vault of Apex Holdings. We officially own the house. You have spent the entire morning aggressively attempting to sell an asset that belongs to a private corporation. The devastating reality of their situation crashed down upon them like a collapsing concrete ceiling. Marcus slumped back into his leather chair, his breath coming in short gasps as the invisible noose finally pulled incredibly tight around her neck. She looked down at the forged consent forms he had so eagerly presented to the broker just minutes ago, suddenly realizing they were not his ticket to a tropical paradise, but rather his signed confession to a massive crime. Stephanie began to shake violently, burying her face in her trembling hands as she let out a low, pathetic moan of pure despair. The unlicensed real estate broker silently grabbed his personal briefcase and attempted to slip out the back door, but the two armed federal agents stepped forward, completely blocking his only route of escape. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic clinking sound echoed ominously in the tense, silent conference room. The agent looked directly at Stephanie and Marcus, his voice projecting the terrifying weight of the federal justice system. Because they attempted to sell an asset they did not own using a forged power of attorney document across state lines, they committed first-degree federal wire fraud. There was absolutely no escape from the permanent consequences of their actions. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus's wrists, the sharp metallic sound cutting through the stunned silence of the conference room. His legs gave out completely. He collapsed against the edge of the mahogany table, letting out a raw, guttural sound of pure panic as the federal agent firmly secured his arms behind his back. All of his arrogant confidence, all of his calculating cruelty completely evaporated in an instant. He looked like a terrified trapped animal, realizing that the cage door had just been permanently locked. Stephanie did not try to run. She did not try to fight. She simply crumbled. She fell heavily to her knees right there on the polished marble floor, her expensive designer suit wrinkling around her shaking body. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as deep, pathetic sobs tore through her chest. The reality of her absolute destruction had finally broken her mind. She looked up at me, her face streaked with hot tears, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. "Dad!" Stephanie cried out, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "I am so sorry. Please, you have to stop this. You cannot do this to us. I am your daughter." He looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor. He searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, for any lingering trace of a father's protective instinct. He found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. My voice was completely devoid of any emotion when I finally answered her. "This house stopped being yours a month ago," I said, every word landing like a heavy final blow. "And you stopped being my daughter the exact day you walked into that hospital and unplugged your mother's machine." Stephanie let out a horrific, agonizing wail. She knew in that precise moment that I had heard the audio recording. She knew that his darkest, most unforgivable sin had been completely exposed to the light. The second federal agent hauled her roughly to his feet, securing her wrists tightly in cold steel. Stephanie tried to reach out toward me, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve, but the agents firmly dragged her backward. Marcus was weeping uncontrollably, his makeup running down his pale cheeks in dark streaks as he was marched out of the glass doors. He stood perfectly still, watching them being paraded away through the crowded real estate lobby in handcuffs. The unlicensed broker sat frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the federal raid that had just destroyed his incredibly lucrative morning. He looked down at his trembling hands, entirely aware that his own illegal business practices were about to be heavily scrutinized by the authorities. The receptionist in the outer hallway gasped out loud, dropping a stack of pristine white papers onto the floor as the agents physically pushed Stephanie and Marcus toward the main elevator bank. Everyone in the luxurious office building was staring at them, their glamorous lives officially over in a single, devastating heartbeat. They were utterly humiliated in front of their wealthy peers, completely stripped of the arrogant facade they had worn for years. Harrison Wright stood quietly beside me, patiently packing his heavy legal files back into his sleek leather briefcase. He closed the brass latches with a solid, definitive snap, offering me a silent nod of profound mutual respect. We walked out of the conference room together, leaving the terrified broker behind us. The nightmare was finally over. The cancer had been surgically, permanently removed from my daily life forever. Fast forward exactly 3 months later. The air out here in Montana is incredibly crisp and clean, entirely untouched by the suffocating smog of the city. I am standing on the wide wooden porch of the massive ranch that Eleanor secretly left me, leaning gently against the sturdy railing outside. The morning sun is just beginning to rise over the jagged mountain peaks, casting a brilliant golden glow across the 10,000 acres of lush, green plains stretching out as far as my eyes can see. In the distance, a small herd of wild horses grazes peacefully near a winding river. The heavy machinery of the Natural Gas Corporation continues its steady, rhythmic work on the horizon, quietly securing my financial independence. I do not feel lonely out here in this vast open space. I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. The legal fallout back in Boston happened extremely fast. It was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating for them. Stephanie and Marcus are currently sitting in federal holding facilities awaiting a criminal trial that will inevitably sentence them to decades in a maximum security prison. They tried to plead for leniency, but the audio recordings and the paper trail of their massive offshore debts provided the prosecution with an airtight, inescapable case. The underground cartel enforcer who threatened my life was swept up in a massive federal raid orchestrated by the authorities using the intelligence Harrison gathered. The dangerous syndicate was completely dismantled, removing the final lingering threat permanently from my existence. As for the massive house in the Boston suburbs, I decided I never wanted to step foot inside those walls ever again. The memories there had been too deeply tainted by their greed and betrayal. Instead of selling it for profit, I instructed Harrison to execute a legal transfer of the property deed to a highly respected local charity. The sprawling 6-bedroom home has now been entirely renovated and officially converted into a free, full-time medical clinic and safe haven for elderly individuals who have been abandoned or abused by their own families. The exact place where my daughter planned to discard me is now a fortress of hope and healing for people who truly need it. It felt like the perfect, ultimate victory over his dark intentions. I take a slow, deep sip of my hot black coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. I look up at the wide, endless blue sky, watching a solitary hawk circle effortlessly on the morning thermal currents. A gentle, cooling breeze sweeps across the porch, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree standing near the front wooden steps. I close my eyes, letting the quiet peace of the ranch wash over my tired soul. For the first time since that terrible day in the hospital, the crushing weight of grief is completely gone. I do not feel broken anymore. I feel completely whole. I smile, knowing that I honored her remarkable legacy by protecting myself and delivering the ultimate justice. I take another breath of the fresh mountain air. And for the very first time in months, I can actually feel Eleanor standing right beside me. We are together again in spirit, watching the beautiful sunrise over the vast, magnificent Montana landscape today. I know she is incredibly proud of the difficult choices I made to defend our family honor. The long, painful chapter of betrayal is finally closed forever. A brand new, profoundly peaceful chapter of my life has officially begun, and I am fully ready to embrace it now. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never blind you to the truth. When you spend your entire life sacrificing for your family, it is easily possible to ignore the obvious red flags of extreme entitlement and pure greed. But true wisdom comes with age and the profound realization that trust must be earned, not blindly given. Evil often wears the familiar face of the very people we care for the absolute most. Do not let sentimentality make you a helpless victim. Stand up. Predict your legacy and never let those who betray you dictate your final chapter. If Robert's story of betrayal and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me how you would have handled Stephanie and Marcus. Let us talk about it in the comments. See you very soon.